Good evening. Welcome to AlumniTALK. How Columbia is ensuring its campus is safe and inclusive. Please welcome Sherry Wolf.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Sherry Panzer-Wolf, class of 1990, and president of the Columbia College Alumni Association. On behalf of the CCAA, I am really excited to introduce the first in our Alumni Talk series, which we have launched to keep alumni informed about current challenges that Columbia is facing. In the past, these talks have focused on showcasing prominent alumni to share their knowledge on important subject matters. This series is distinct for two reasons. First, we invited accomplished alumni in the field of journalism to lead a topical conversation. And second, we are highlighting key faculty and administrators who can provide a critical lens on how Columbia is navigating the tense climate on campus. Tonight's conversation will highlight the important work of Columbia's Task Force on Anti-Semitism and its efforts to protect free speech and academic freedom. The ultimate goal of their work is to promote a safe, respectful, and inclusive environment for all members of the Columbia community. The discussion this evening focuses on the recommendations of the task force's first report, which was issued at the beginning of March. This report provided a comprehensive review of the university's rules governing demonstrations and provided suggestions for how the rules and enforcement of those rules could be improved. We are so grateful to have in conversation tonight Jen Maxfield Osfeld from the class of 1999 and Professor David Shizer, Dean Emeritus, and the Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics at Columbia Law School. Jen Maxfield Osfeld is an Emmy Award-winning reporter and anchor who has been covering New York City for 21 years, currently for NBC New York and previously for Eyewitness News. Jen is also an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University, where she teaches broadcast journalism. She previously taught at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, the same school where she got her master's degree in 2000. She majored in political science at Columbia College, where she received a BA in 1999, summa cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa. While on campus, Jen wrote for the Columbia Daily Spectator and met her husband, Scott Ostfeld, from the Columbia College class of 1998 in an art history class. Professor David Shizer is Dean Emeritus and Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics at Columbia Law School. He served as dean from 2004 to 2014 and as CEO of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a global Jewish humanitarian organization, from 2017 to 2019. Professor Shizer is the author of How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, Bringing Out the Best in Nonprofits. A co-chair of Columbia University's new task force on anti-Semitism, he also is a co-founder and co-chair of the Center for Israeli Legal Studies at Columbia Law School, co-founder and co-chair of the Richmond Center for Law, Business, and Public Policy, and a charter trustee of Ramaz. He served as a law clerk to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court and Judge Alex Kozinski on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Before we begin, please note that if you would like to participate in the Q&A during tonight's discussion, please enter your question into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and please include your graduating year. Your entry is only going to be visible to the facilitator, and if your question is selected, we will ask it on your behalf. Please submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. We are extremely fortunate to have these two distinguished members of the Columbia community kick off our new Alumni Talk series tonight, and I will now turn it over to Jen for this critically important conversation. Jen?
Sherry, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thank you so much to the CCAA team for all the planning that went into tonight's program. And thanks to all of you, the hundreds of Columbia alumni who are joining us from around the world tonight. In fact, we have alums representing graduation years that span 8 decades on this call right now. And this topic about ensuring campus safety for all is of critical importance. And that's not just for the current students, the faculty and staff at Columbia, but also for those of us in the alumni community as well. I'm so grateful for the work of Columbia's Task Force on Anti-Semitism, which is led by Professors Esther Fuchs and Nick Lemon, and of course, our esteemed guest tonight, Professor and former Dean of Columbia Law School, David Shizer. Now, before we get started with many questions that I know we're all looking forward to tonight, and we will be getting to some of your questions as well, as Sherry noted, I do want to be clear and intentional about tonight's conversations. We're going to hear about what the task force has already recommended, what they're working on next, and how we can expect this to be adopted and enforced. It is important, though, that all of us here on this call understand that David and I are not going to be able to discuss specific people and investigations or any disciplinary proceedings related to them. We can also talk about the future work of the task force, but future conclusions, by definition, are going to be hard to predict since the group is still doing its work. But once again, I thank you, David, for your work as co-chair of the task force and for being here tonight and spending the time to educate all of us about what you and your colleagues have been working on. But I did want to start with a broader topic of nonprofits, a subject you just wrote the book about, How to Save the World in 6 Not So Easy Steps. So you wrote this book about nonprofit management. Let's start tonight with telling us what inspired you to write it.
So Jen, thank you so much for doing this, and thanks everyone for including me. This series is a great idea, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it. It is true, I've spent a bunch of time writing a book on nonprofits because I've really spent my career in nonprofits. And the book comes from the fact that I have really a love-hate relationship with nonprofits. And it's 95% love because I love the missions, but there is a 5% to it, which is about frustration. And maybe the best way to illustrate that is with a recollection. Sherry mentioned that I spent a few years as the CEO of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC. It's an international humanitarian organization. I came from Columbia, came from the outside, and it was new to me, and there was a lot I needed to learn. So I spent time meeting lots of different people. And so I'll share recollections of 2 conversations with 2 different JDC veteran professionals. So I sat down with the first, and he looked at me and he said, "David, I don't care about JDC at all, and neither should you." I was a bit taken aback. That's an unusual way to begin a conversation, but I knew more was coming. And so he said, "I don't care about JDC. I care about JDC's clients, and I care about JDC's mission. And so, David, you're coming in from the outside. Some things we do here may seem wrong to you, and maybe I'm responsible for some of them," he said. "So my point is, it's not that you have my permission to make changes. You have a moral obligation to make changes because I don't care about JDC at all. I care about JDC's clients." So I repeat that because in my opinion, it's one of the best formulations I've ever heard of exactly the way we ought to think about nonprofits. The mission comes first. It can't be about ourselves. It can't be about ego. It can't be about blind faith in the past. It's always about figuring out the most effective way going forward to advance our mission. But there was another conversation. And the other conversation was a different senior professional sat down with me, and he took me through the details of how he did his job. And the phrase, "This is how we do things at JDC," came up at least every 2 minutes. So 45 minutes goes by, we finish the meeting, and I said to him, "Listen, I just want to ask you for a favor for our next conversation. It's helpful for me to hear that, but I'd also really love to know what you think needs to be fixed here. What changes are you looking for?" And he looked at me like I'd sprouted a second head out of my shoulder and didn't say much. But when he came back for the next meeting, he said to me, "David, I know that you want to hear what I think should change here, but I'm just going to tell you how we do things here at JDC." And that's one of the sources of concern.
I think it's interesting to hear about the subject of your book to really understand your mindset as well going into this task force on anti-Semitism. You wrote to bring out the best in nonprofits. Your book offers the 6 Ps. Can you give us an example of one of them from your time when you were dean of the law school?
So look, I think that the point of the book is to say we need to figure out the best way to advance our mission, and we need to get everybody on board to do it. And the 6 Ps are different ways to try to get people on board to do it. One of the Ps is prioritize, and one of the points I make in the book is that you have to figure out what is best to do and then raise money for that. And so it's really program that has to drive fundraising, but unfortunately, sometimes it works the other way. And I had a colleague once who would say it wasn't a priority before, but now that we have a gift, it's become a priority. And I think it's a really bad idea, because if you weren't going to do it anyway, then maybe there's a reason you weren't going to do it. Maybe you aren't good at it. Maybe it's not the right thing for you, which means, and it runs contrary to the way people think about nonprofits often, but sometimes you have to turn down a gift. And I'll just share one memory from the law school. I was a new dean, got a call. Someone said to me, hey, I have this yacht. It's appreciated and I don't use it anymore. It's costing me a lot to maintain it. And I'd like to give it to the law school. Well, if there are any tax lawyers listening, you'll see the problem that I saw. I'm a tax lawyer. And the problem is that when you give away a yacht or something tax lawyers call a collectible, like a painting, you have to give it to the right kind of charity, specifically a charity that'll use it in its mission, because that's the only way that you can deduct its fair market value. Otherwise, you're going to deduct what you paid for it, which is less in this case. So I said, that's so generous, but listen, I think we're the wrong kind of charity. And when you speak to your tax advisor, you're going to find out that you really ought to give this to a maritime academy, but I hope you'll think of us for something else. So hung up the phone. He called me back the next day. He said, oh, it turns out you were right. I knew I was right. But I have a solution. I said, what's that? He said, well, I'll give you the yacht and then you'll use it. You'll teach classes on it. So have to admit that as a teacher, I had never thought that teaching tax or some other subject was best done in a maritime setting. So we turned down that gift. Again, you decide what you need and you raise money for it, not the other way around.
That is definitely one of those stories that sticks with you through the years. I'm sure you'll be telling that one for many years to come. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do have alums from all over the world on this call right now. And I'm hoping, David, that you can give us a read of the situation on campus right now. I know you think that this moment feels different from other moments that you've seen on campus over the almost 3 decades that you've been at Columbia. Why does this protest movement on campus feel different to you?
So most of the times that we've seen protests before, the protest has been directed at people who run the university. Certainly, there were protests directed at me as dean years ago, but it really kind of ended there. And the difference here is we actually have different groups of students who were in effect protesting each other and causing each other to be uncomfortable and in pain and all the rest. And so I think it's that idea that you have 2 impassioned groups of students who are sort of counter-protesting each other, which makes the situation maybe more tense than I've seen before, and truthfully, harder to manage, but in ways more important to manage, because we want to be sure that everybody feels comfortable.
And I know that you and the other members of the task force have been doing listening sessions with students. Can you give us examples of what you're hearing? The report itself cites Jewish and Israeli students confronted with racist epithets and graffiti, among other things.
It's a difficult time. And so the truth is we've heard some things that are really heartbreaking. And it ranges from a very classic form of anti-Semitic activity. I have a wonderful student, wears a kippah. He was walking along in the law school and someone walked up to him and just said, F the Jews. Didn't know him, just saw him wearing a kippah. That's what he did. This was actually not a law student, but a Columbia affiliate. Another law student whom I know, really terrific, also wears a kippah. He went to watch a protest, pro-Palestinian protest. He didn't agree with it, but he was just standing there watching it when some people spit on him and started speaking in stereotypical terms about what they expected from him and all the rest. So you see that. And I'd say the other component of this, which is also really heartbreaking and really difficult, is there's a way in which communal bonds are fraying and in which students no longer feel comfortable in settings where they used to and should. And so one of the problems is that some student groups, for example, are introducing litmus tests, whether formally or informally, about who can participate. And as an example of this, at the law school, we have a great student activity where the students will go and represent New York City public school students who've been suspended, and there's a suspension hearing, and the law student will come and represent them. And so that group joined a statement right after October 7th, essentially blaming Israel for the atrocities that Hamas committed. And there have been other things that have happened. And so you have some students who've just become really uncomfortable with that and have had to leave the group. And the truth is, I think that a group that is about helping New York City public school kids should just be about that and not about controversies in the Middle East. But unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that we're seeing, and it's difficult.
Yes, and we're going to get to this later because we do have an alumni question on this point as well, discussing about how some of these BDS statements are being adopted by clubs that have no political mission whatsoever. Something like, for example, the Ultimate Frisbee team. And I do want to get back to that. But let's talk about the task force. The task force has 3 areas of work. One is the university rules, which we're going to get back to in a moment. Can you tell us, please, David, what are the other 2?
Yeah, so it's really important that we understand what the experience is of Jewish students who are supportive of Israel, Jewish students who are critical of Israel, other folks on campus. And I think that there is a lot that we don't know, and there are theories about what they're experiencing, but really serious research that actually tries to understand the situation of everyone on campus is a critical prerequisite to being able to diagnose and then solve problems. And so the university, I think, did a really important thing a few years ago in conducting a study about, it's very upsetting, it's very sad, about sexual assault on campus. And there's a book called Sexual Citizens, which I think is a really excellent book. And it's based on surveys, and it's based on hundreds of interviews with lots of students on campus. And you read the book and you say, oh, now I understand what was happening. And it does help people develop solutions. So we would like to do something similar about the climate on campus today. So there's a research working group. Nick Lemon is chairing that. We have some amazing people working on that group. And then we have another working group that Esther Fuchs is chairing, and that's on academic policy. So what should orientations look like going forward? How can we be more effective in promoting a more inclusive environment? What are the gaps in our curriculum? How is our DEI programming working, and are there ways that it ought to be adjusted? What are the best practices in classrooms? There's a lot to do there, and we're hopeful that we can produce at least a partial report on those subjects, even by commencement. The longer term project that I mentioned, the research project, that's going to take many months.
So the report came out earlier this month. It's available online. I do encourage people to read it, and I appreciate how much work and effort and thoughtfulness went into it. And I would like to really dive into the report. This first report is about the university rules governing protests. And I know that you're a staunch defender of free speech. And of course, that's a core value at a great university like Columbia. So what does that mean for protests? Is it just anything goes?
So this is the fundamental question that we were trying to explore in the report. And so we do get into a lot of detail, but we start with 3 basic principles that we think any great university should apply in regulating protests. And I'm happy to say, I think Columbia's rules already, to a significant extent, do implement these principles. And so I'll say what they are. The first is freedom of speech. And Jen, as you said, it is a core value at a university. We're looking to understand the world. We have to follow ideas to the logical conclusion, and there can't be sort of ideas that are off limits and litmus tests. It's just not the spirit of academic freedom that you need at a great university. So free speech rights is the first principle. But then there's also the second principle, which is free speech responsibilities. And so the fact that I, David, have free speech rights should not allow me to interfere, Jen, with your free speech rights. And so although I have the right to speak, I don't have the right to shout you down or to drown out your speaker or to tear down or deface your posters. And so these wonderful First Amendment cases from over the years talk about a heckler's veto. And that's a really important way to promote free speech, is to prevent that. You can't shout other people down. And similarly, at a university, yes, I can protest, but it would be a real problem if I showed up either inside or outside the class that you teach and made it impossible for the students in your class to hear you, because after all, they have their own free speech rights to speak to you, to hear what you have to say, and so on. So we have free speech rights and we have free speech responsibilities. And then the third principle, which is also foundational, it's a core value at the university, is anti-discrimination. We're committed to the idea that we're a campus that is open and inclusive and welcoming for everyone, regardless of national origin, regardless of race, regardless of religion, military service, disability, all of the rest. And not only is that a matter of values, but it's also a matter of law, because the university is subject to federal law, Title VI, and also to New York law as well. So 3 principles.
So I'd like to, with that being said, let's talk about the Speaker's Corner approach to protest that the committee's report endorses. Your report notes, and you touched on this in your last answer, the demonstration should not be allowed in academic buildings, should not be allowed in dormitories or dining halls. And I think all of us on this call know that demonstrations have indeed happened on campus at Columbia in all of those venues I just named in the past several months. How could the Speaker's Corner approach work to consolidate the protest to one geographic area on campus?
So look, it's really important to allow people to protest. It's critical not to impose tests based on content or based on viewpoint. It can't be the case that you're only allowed to protest if you believe X, but not if you believe Y. And so we really do need to protect the right of everyone to protest. But that doesn't mean that they also have the right to disrupt the academic activities of the university. And this is how we balance the free speech rights, which are sacred, with the free speech responsibilities, which are also really critical. And so I personally am a fan of the idea of sort of a Hyde Park Speaker's Corner. There's a prominent place within campus where you go if you want to protest. And needless to say, it shouldn't be some warehouse in New Jersey. It has to be a central location where the protest is heard and taken seriously and people can join it. But it shouldn't be in academic buildings, because that can get in the way of classroom activity, and it's just not fair to the people who are looking to hear their professors. So this is why I'm a big fan of the idea. University's recent policy announced a little less than a month ago that on the Columbia campus, this happens on South Lawn and at the Sundial, and on the Barnard campus, it happens on Futter Field. And you can sign up from noon to 6, 5 days a week, as long as classes are in session. And I think that's a really good way to balance these 2 important principles.
Right. And in fact, President Shafiq's statement on the first report of the Anti-Semitism Task Force noted this rule governing protest and the Speaker's Corner approach, correct?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is something that the task force supports. It's something that the university has done. And I think it's a major step forward.
So with that being said, let's talk about enforcement, because that is the content of a lot of the questions that have come in from alums this evening. And it's important not just to have the right rules, which you outlined so beautifully, but also to have effective enforcement. So how has Columbia been doing there in your estimation? For example, the university has taken the stance or policy at prior protests of de-escalation of these on-campus protests, but your report suggests a slightly different approach. And I'm hoping you can give us some insights into that, and also how you believe that might lead to an improvement in campus climate.
So look, words on a page aren't enough. And I actually think the rules, even before we made any suggestions and even before the university added this new demonstration policy, I think the rules were pretty good. There are things we recommend changing, needless to say. But the biggest problem has been ineffective enforcement. I think there's no question about that in my mind. We've fallen short in enforcing these rules. And so I will say a key point that is emphasized in our report is the need for effective enforcement. But I have to say that I think it would be boring and a bit unhelpful if that's all we said. And so what we tried hard to do was to identify what I guess I would call blockages in the enforcement process. But what's the reason why the enforcement hasn't been effective? And fortunately, I think we and others have been pretty successful in figuring out some of the challenges. So one of them goes back to where we started a few minutes ago, Jen. I do think that for a long time, we viewed protests as something that you can wait out because the main cost of the protest might fall on someone like a dean or the university president or other senior leaders. And no, we're grown-ups and we can take it and that's okay. And so you sort of say, look, you have a view, you want to express it, you want to take over my office. Okay, that's fine. I have another office. I'll go there. And I think that attitude, which dates back to 1968 and some of the protests then, it's a view that can make sense, but it really doesn't fit the current environment when the protests are having effect not so much on the senior leadership of the university, but on students, right? If each group of students is causing some pain and discomfort to the other, then this idea of waiting it out, it isn't appropriate. It doesn't fit. And so as an example, I think that we have a team of people, they're called rules delegates. They work for the university and part of their role is to manage protests. Quite appropriately, they view it as a key part of their job to avoid escalation and to avoid violence. And I agree with that. But I also think that part of the job is to try to educate students and inform them when they're not following rules and to find ways to get them to stop even as they're doing it. And that's something that wasn't happening often enough. And we recommend needs to happen now. And so just to be a bit more concrete about that, if people show up and start protesting in an academic building and it violates the new demonstrations policies, of course it does, the right thing to do is to say, hey guys, you know that you're allowed to protest, but you're not allowed to protest here. And so here's a card which reminds you of what the rules say about this subject, just to be sure you know. And it's now 6:29, and my colleagues and I are going to take a walk. And in 10 minutes at 6:39, we're going to come back and we're going to have to start taking names and we're going to have to start initiating disciplinary processes. But it would really be much better if in 10 minutes you folks have gone about your day and you're not here anymore. And I do think that if that kind of approach can help students be reminded of what the policies are and to discourage them from violating the policies, then it'll be a different atmosphere on campus. And again, people will be free to protest, but in the right places.
We are going to get to specific questions from alums in a couple of minutes, but there have been certain themes that have emerged from the dozens of questions we've received in advance of this event tonight. And we do have a lot of questions from alums about why students have not been disciplined for clearly violating the university's rules on protests and hate speech. And as I said at the outset, I understand that neither you nor the university, for that matter, can comment on that because it would be a FERPA violation. But the report does endorse a more transparent process with aggregate reporting of just how many disciplinary investigations are underway, how many have been adjudicated, and how. This would seem to allay some assumptions that people have and that people certainly can make that Columbia hasn't disciplined anyone because nothing has been reported. Can you talk about the recommendations the task force is making about this aggregate reporting of discipline on campus?
Yeah, so I hear constantly from people who think that there's no discipline happening. And I should be clear, I don't know the details of any disciplinary action, but I have been able myself to find out a bit more about what's happening in the aggregate. And the answer is there's a lot happening. And so it's important that the whole community should know that. It's important because, for one thing, students should understand that there are consequences for some of the things that they do, and it's only fair that they know that. And I also think that there are people who are demoralized because they feel like rules aren't being enforced, and they ought to know that actually there has been enforcement. Now, I would like to see more effective enforcement, and we've talked about that. But I do think that the university should share more information about what's actually happening. And as long as it's aggregated and not about individual cases, I think there won't be an issue under law.
In your scenario about the protest in the academic building, I believe you were talking about students, and certainly I thought of it as you were saying it as an example pertaining to students. But there's also a question about Columbia faculty. How can the university address the issue of its very own faculty members speaking at some of these unauthorized protests, or even shielding the identity of students who participate in these protests and break the rules? The report says these actions by faculty send confusing signals to students.
So I do think that it's important for the entire community to commit to the idea that we all have free speech rights, and we also have free speech responsibilities. And a rule like the Speaker's Corner approach is there to protect everybody's free speech rights. Again, you can protest, no limits on that. You can go to the relevant places, you can sign up. It's just that you can't do it in a way that interferes with other people's right to speak and teach and learn and research. And I do think that when everybody commits to these principles, we're all better off. And so my hope is that faculty will feel that way. And as a former dean, I know that current deans are in a pretty good position to remind colleagues about the importance of that. And so I hope that's what will happen.
You mentioned a third principle before, and that was anti-discrimination. How does that square with the fact that free speech is protected?
So lots of free speech is protected. My own preference is to protect as much as can be protected, but harassment is not protected speech, and I think that's something that our audience understands. And so the point is, we also have to enforce these anti-discrimination rules because they're also foundational as a commitment of the university, and frankly, they're also legally mandated.
When universities, though, try to protect free speech and combat discrimination, is there a legal difference between a state university and a private university like Columbia?
Yes. So we at Columbia care deeply about free speech, but the First Amendment doesn't actually apply to a private university. It does apply at a state university like the University of Michigan, the University of Virginia. And so there they actually have to balance the First Amendment against Title VI, which is the key federal rule outlawing a hostile learning and working environment at a university. We also have to balance free speech norms and Title VI, but the difference is that the free speech norms are in some sense voluntary or contractual. It's a commitment that we make to each other, but it's not because of the First Amendment since we're not the government.
Interesting. Now, you say the rules should clarify what discrimination means. What do you recommend exactly?
So we think that there are three categories of discriminatory harassment that can arise from protest-related activity. And so that's what we talk about in the report. And really what we're doing is we're applying Title VI, which is a federal statute which applies to universities that take federal money. And a key principle there is that you can't have a hostile learning or work environment. So that's a good guidepost, but let's try to get more specific than that. And so the three things we highlight are, first of all, ethnic slurs. Obviously, you can't do that. That clearly contributes to a hostile environment. Second is stereotyping. So if, for example, people make assumptions about students or faculty member who served in the Israeli Defense Forces and start suggesting things about them just because of their military service, well, that's a form of stereotyping. It's pretty familiar in anti-discrimination law, and it's not okay under the university rules or under Title VI. And then the third thing that we highlight are calls for violence or murder or genocide, rape, enslavement, all these terrible things. But again, calls to violence against protected classes, also a quintessential example of discrimination that our rules don't allow.
And I would like to put a very fine point on this topic about hate speech, because your report considers how to strike this balance, right? And this tension between free speech and combating discrimination. So what does the report recommend?
So the report says that those are three key areas where the university needs to offer more clarity in the rules. And so, and the rules, I think, already make these points. But I am myself impressed by what the university did some years ago under Title IX, which is about gender-based misconduct. And what the university did is they produced more detailed rules, which have what the rules call scenarios. I'm a tax lawyer, so I think of them as sort of like examples, but it's the same point. And it'll say X does this, and Y does this, and the result is this. And I think the more the university can offer examples to give guidance to people, the clearer the rules will be. And those scenarios, they're likely to be pretty clearer cases, but that's okay. Because when you get a case that's not as easy, then the endeavor is to say, well, is it more like this clear case or is it more like that clear case? So basically, we call for that kind of guidance. And since this is just compliance with law, this is the university's legal team that we urge will do this, because it's really their responsibility.
My dog Rocket is barking in the background. Sorry about that, everyone, in case you're wondering. Everything's fine. So you're the co-chair of the Columbia Committee on the Task Force on Anti-Semitism, but the report itself, at least this first report from your committee, does not define anti-Semitism. Why not?
So that's really because of Title VI. And so this is a report on rules. And the relevant concept under the rules is not anti-Semitism, it's discriminatory harassment. And this concept of discriminatory harassment is something that applies to all protected classes at Columbia. So it applies to Black students and faculty, Latino students and faculty, people with disabilities, and so on. And so one of the principles under Title VI, one of the requirements, is that you can't treat protected classes differently. So actually having a definition of anti-Semitic discriminatory harassment, sort of something specifically tailored to Jews, would in and of itself be a Title VI problem. So when you're analyzing Title VI, it's absolutely the wrong place to try to think about different definitions of anti-Semitism and how they interact. There are likely to be other parts of our work where we're much more interested in that question. But when we were talking about Title VI and rules, it wasn't just irrelevant, it was actually inappropriate to do that.
And I appreciate you making that distinction. It really furthers everyone's understanding who's listening to this event tonight. So you've mentioned precedent and you referred to Columbia's response in the past to issues of gender-based violence, for example. And when I was reading through the task force report, I thought one very interesting distinction that the task force report makes is how the university interprets speech that might interfere with others' ability to learn and work. So in recent years, you note that Columbia has typically deferred to protected classes' views. If they felt offended by the speech, that was enough. However, the report notes that the university has not been consistent in this approach. And when Israeli or Jewish students have complained, it has been the speaker's intent that has been the focus, and not whether the words caused harm to the people in the protected group. So how should the university judge whether speech is offensive? Should they use the perspective of the speaker and their intention in saying the words, or the audience and how they're hearing them?
Yeah, look, there's a hard question here, and there's an easier question here. The hard question is, there are good reasons to focus on the audience, the protected class, and their pain and discomfort. And there are also good reasons to focus on the speaker and their intentions and their rights to speak. And so it would be entirely plausible to adopt either perspective as a matter of values. I have a view. The task force did not take a position on that, but that's the hard question. The easy question is, we have to use the same approach for all protected classes, Consistency is necessary. And it gets back to something I said before. Title VI requires that all protected classes be treated the same. And so it's a Title VI violation in and of itself to have different standards for different protected classes. We can't do that. So there is some room to decide whether to focus more or less on the audience as opposed to the speaker, but we have to be uniform in what we do.
Well, you've offered an excellent segue to one of our first alumni questions that I'd like to get to now. And this is from Daniel Sang, CC 77, Law 80. The report notes that though you focus on anti-Semitism, your recommendations can also bolster efforts to combat Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, and other forms of bigotry. So Daniel asks, is there a greater degree of protection afforded to pro-Israel Jewish students than Palestinian American, other Arab American, and pro-Palestinian students? And if so, why? And how are you distinguishing between speech or expression deemed anti-Semitic and speech or expression that is critical of Israel or pro-Palestinian? Thank you.
So that is an excellent question. It's really two questions. And I'll say this. When President Shafik created our task force, she said she hoped that what we learned and the analysis we produced would be helpful to the university in combating all forms of hate. And we would certainly like to accomplish that. And my hope is that the analysis that we just did does offer insights that are useful across the board, because really what we were trying to do was to answer the broader question: how do we guarantee free speech while at the same time protecting everyone's rights to speech, to speak, teach, and learn, and also preventing discrimination? So that mandate, that topic, is much broader than anti-Semitism. And my hope is that we've managed to offer guidance that applies across the board. It is certainly the case, it must be the case, that Jewish or pro-Israel students, shouldn't, and I think don't, have more protections than pro-Palestinian students, who, by the way, might be Jewish or they might not be Jewish. The protections need to be uniform. And my hope is that they are, and they certainly need to be. And then the second question, how are we defining anti-Semitism? Really interesting question. Again, in this report, we couldn't and shouldn't get into that because, again, this idea of discriminatory harassment, that needs to be a uniform concept that applies across the board. But there are interesting questions about what is anti-Semitism, when are criticisms of Israel anti-Semitic? Clearly, many aren't. Some would say none are. I think perhaps some are. But our task force hasn't addressed that. I can offer my own personal opinions at this point, but it is clearly something that we need to think about.
And that also leads me to another question we got. I mentioned that we have alums that span graduation years of 8 decades, one of whom is Tom Ettinger from the Columbia College class of 1958. And this question dovetails with the end of your last answer, but if you wanted to add anything. Tom was interested in knowing, and this is what he wrote: as a Holocaust survivor, I am interested in whether Columbia University is distinguishing between Israeli political actions and people merely identified as being Jewish.
So I commend the questioner for the experiences he's had in his life and respect him and the question that he's posing. Look, it's very clear that one can criticize the United States government and still love the United States. And I am certain that everyone on this call has found at least something to disagree with in the past 2 administrations, just because they're different. And therefore, you couldn't possibly agree with what the Trump administration and the Biden administration have done in sum total. So when we criticize our own government, does that mean that somehow we're biased against the United States? No, of course it doesn't mean that. And so the same applies to the Israeli government. And therefore, I personally have criticisms that I could offer. We could spend hours talking about that. So there is clearly a right for everyone to criticize the government of Israel and its policies. But I think, on the other hand, when you're in a situation where people are applying a standard to Israel that they don't apply to other countries, then that becomes the kind of situation where you might classify those criticisms as something more than just the run-of-the-mill criticism that you would offer of any government.
And this is a Columbia College Alumni Association event. The college has an engaged group of alums. And this next question from Alan Freeman, Columbia College class of 1993, really speaks to the importance of this issue within the Columbia alumni community and for the continued strong reputation of the university. Alan asks, what can alumni do to ensure that the university and college administrations follow through on their words with meaningful actions?
So look, one of the things I find so inspiring about our university is the level of interest and passion that people bring to alma mater. And so the point is just participating in a program like this, learning what's happening, being in touch with class volunteers, being in touch with the leadership of the university. It makes a difference, because what you think and what you say, it really does matter. And I can tell you from personal experience that I know the leaders of the university are really interested in what everyone thinks. And so just making your voice heard is a very constructive thing to do.
We have another question here from Frank Lancelotti. He's Columbia College class of 1975. And I think you touched on this earlier in the speaker's corner explanation that you gave to all of us, but I want to repeat the question that Frank posed. He said, I want to make sure that students are not being prevented by anyone from attending class. Do you not agree that formal education and research are the primary reasons for a university?
I emphatically agree. And I will say this in practical terms. It is not a cheap thing to come to Columbia College or to any of the schools at Columbia. It is expensive in terms of the commitment of years of your life, and it involves a lot of money, which means that people have a right to get the education that they've been promised. And that means that classes need to continue, and you have to be able to hear your professor, and you have to be able to go from class to class without disruption. And so absolutely, that is a fundamental feature of our community and of our mission, and we have to guarantee it. And at the same time, we need to be sure that the members of our community can also express their views, which is why we have to find ways to accommodate both. I think the Speaker's Corner is a great way to do that. But really, the fundamental premise of that analysis is education is fundamental and non-negotiable.
I want to go next to a question from Candace Hua, who is Columbia College class of 1994. And I thought this was a really thoughtful question, and I appreciate it very much. She asks, why do you think recent events have served largely to divide campus communities instead of unite them? And she asks, what can leadership and all of us do better to foster a more resilient sense of community and togetherness in terms of common values and principles going forward? Thank you.
So I agree with the premise of that question, because at the end of the day, it is entirely natural, and there's nothing wrong with the fact that members of our community would disagree. And the more important the issue, the more likely people are to feel strongly about it. And so if we all agreed, that would be surprising, and it's not the way the world works, and I certainly wouldn't expect it. What I do expect, and what I think we should all expect, is that we treat each other collegially and civilly when we disagree. And it's not an easy thing to do, because the more passionate you are, maybe the more impatient you are with people who don't think the way you do. But in order for each of us as individuals to succeed and achieve our potential, it's something we need to learn. And in order for our society to function in the ways that it needs to function, we all need to do that. And so I do think that a key responsibility of the university is to educate our members about that. And I know that this is a strong strong conviction of President Shafiq, and she has been really pushing the idea of difference with civility, and she's been holding events to try to encourage that and all the rest. And so, again, I think the spirit of that question is exactly right, and we will be at our best when we're able to do that more successfully.
David, before we move on to more questions coming in from alumni, I do want to ask about two concerns from Jewish and Israeli students on campus that have been widely reported in the Columbia Daily Spectator, which I used to write for and still read, and elsewhere. One is the BDS resolution that the Columbia College Student Council plans to put to a referendum later this spring. And two, the increasing number of BDS pledges being developed by Columbia student clubs that receive financial support from the university, clubs like Ultimate Frisbee and the Varsity Show that have no ostensible political mission. So would these actions, these litmus tests, more or less, be viewed as exercises of free speech by these student organizations, or would they be considered discriminatory, especially the referendum that the Columbia College Student Council is proposing, which also calls to end the dual degree program with Tel Aviv University and to cancel the opening of the Columbia Global Center in Tel Aviv, Israel?
So I'll answer on a couple of levels, Jen. I think I'll say that as a community, we talk about things. And so the fact that members of our community have raised the idea of divesting from Israel and severing ties is something they can do, and they've done it regularly over the past years. I am not in favor of this. I'm very much opposed. I think that the university benefits enormously from connections with Israel, and I could spend a lot of time talking about why that's the case. But I do think another aspect to this, which I personally have always found puzzling, is that we have connections, we have research, we have joint programs with lots and lots of other countries in the world. We could spend some time talking about why the Chinese government is not perfect and the Jordanian government is not perfect and the Turkish government is not perfect, and we have programs. And I think the idea is the university doesn't do that kind of analysis. It's more a question of, are these important areas to learn? And so I think it would be useful to try to apply a consistent standard there, because I don't really understand why it's Israel that gets singled out as opposed to other countries. But in any event, just my view, not speaking for the task force and saying that. But I do want to turn to this question of litmus tests, which I think is more troubling. Because if we're talking about a club that is directly related to an issue, then I can understand the argument for a litmus test. And so if you are a student club about the Middle East or about geopolitics, and you'd like to express a view, that makes sense to me. And it could be that some people don't agree with the view and they decide they don't want to be in the club anymore, and that's a shame, but I understand it. But when you're talking about student clubs that don't have an immediate connection to an issue, then to me it is a much more troubling thing. I think people should learn to play Ultimate Frisbee together without regard to their views of the Middle East. And to me, it kind of gets back to my own view of nonprofits, which is that you have a mission, you focus on the mission, members of your community may have views on other issues, and that's fine, but there are other nonprofits which allow them to express that, and that's the way it ought to work.
Tara Kupferberg, Columbia College 18, International Affairs 19, spoke to this issue as well, and I wonder if you heard some of this echoed from the current students, really this notion of sort of the frayed bonds of community at Columbia among the college student body. She says Jewish students are being excluded from extracurricular activities, either explicitly or implicitly, unless they are comfortable signing on to these student groups' BDS statements. This is limiting students' social circles and ability to take full advantage of their time at Columbia. How is Columbia addressing this, she asks.
Yeah, look, I think that that's a really significant issue, and I am very troubled by it. And I would be troubled if member of any student, any community was saying, we feel excluded. So it's bad if it's Jews, it's bad if it's other groups, and it's exactly the wrong result for our community. So I will say it is one of the issues that the task force is going to be looking at going forward. We also do hope that the adjustments in the rules that we're proposing and in enforcement that we're proposing can change the tone of the campus in a way that will contribute positively on that dimension as well.
And David, we are fortunate to have the ability on this call to take some live questions, people who are submitting questions prompted by our conversation here. So I'm going to raise one that was asked by Fred Kushner. I think it touches on some of our conversation earlier about why not define anti-Semitism in the task force on the subject. Fred asks, why call this a task force on anti-Semitism instead of a task force on Title VI?
Well, I think if all we were doing was that first report, then perhaps it could be a task force on free speech and anti-discrimination and rules. But that is just the first of many things that we're going to do. And to be honest, the reason we wanted to start with it is our sense that a lot of what's happening within the campus climate overall is being shaped by protests. And we think that protests that are structured the right way, which are free and loud, but also don't interfere with other people's rights, we think that that will contribute enormously to the well-being of all students. So it was the place to start, in our view, but it isn't where we're going to finish. We've got more to do.
And another question on semantics, and we had talked about before this idea of is speech hateful because the person intends for it to be hateful or because a group hears it as hateful. Lee asks, suppose a group calls for, in quotes, a worldwide intifada. There is disagreement about what exactly that phrase, worldwide intifada, means. And so Lee asks, how is this resolved?
Yeah. Again, I think this is an example of a situation where there's the way it's heard. And there's a new study out of the University of Chicago. Bob Pape did a study just published a few days ago, which documents how certain chants are heard as very threatening by Jewish students. And at the same time, there are people who say, but it's not what I meant. And so it gets us back to that question. Are we going to be focusing on the audience and how they hear something? Or are we going to focus on the intention and what people meant? And there's room in the Title VI analysis for both, in the sense that the standard under Title VI is, does the protected class subjectively feel this harm? And also, would a reasonable person feel it too? So there's sort of the subjective and the objective both. I imagine the government is going to give some guidance. It wouldn't surprise me if they do. But I think the real point is we as a university and we as a community have to be consistent in the way we do that. And so if we've been focusing on audiences and other settings, we either have to do that for Israeli and Jewish students now, or we have to change the general approach for other groups.
There were a few questions submitted ahead of time along a similar theme. And again, we can't talk about specific investigations into any faculty member, but Harvey Kurzweil, Columbia College class of 1966, Law 69, asks, what steps are being taken against faculty members who are calling for the elimination of Israel? Lisa Kasser, CCO1, GF11, asks something similar, which is what can be done to ensure faculty compliance with new demonstration regulation enforcement?
So, look, I think we're all employees of Columbia University, and so we're all bound by the rules of the community, and that is as it should be. And those rules need to be protective of academic freedom and the free speech rights of faculty as well as students. So we really don't want to be in a place where senior officials at the university can kind of tell us what we can and can't say generally. That's not what we should have at a great university. And at the same time, there are laws that bind the university and all of us, and there are norms that bind all of us. And so I guess what I would say is there are many ways to articulate a view which are collegial but also sharp. And then there are other ways to do it that are way over the line and problematic. And so I think faculty members generally have really good judgment about the difference. But this is part of what it means to be a university as we do our best.
It might be a good time to take a step back. Whitney Nadeau, PS 22, asks, what is the disciplinary process for formal complaints against a faculty member or a student? And how are complaints investigated to determine if there has been a real violation?
Yeah, this is something that is not well known within our community. I have a feeling students often don't know. I'm sure that faculty mostly don't know. And I'll tell you, I was a dean for 10 years, and I didn't know the nuances in the way that I've learned them now. So I will say there are different tracks. And one very simple division is you've got disciplinary processes for faculty and professional staff. And then you've got disciplinary processes for students, and they are separate. And one can understand why they're separate, although the rules aren't necessarily different. They usually aren't particularly different. And then within that, there are different kinds of issues that are adjudicated and investigated in different ways. So if you're talking about a violation of a rule about protests generally, that's called the Rules of University Conduct. It's a body of rules that were created by the University Senate. And there are what are called judicial boards that adjudicate specific instances under those rules. And it's the Senate that constitutes those judicial boards, although they aren't usually senators, but you can think of that as a Senate-run process. And so that's sort of the general rules about protests. But then if you're talking about anti-discrimination issues, that's not the Senate. That is a different set of processes. We have something special for gender-based misconduct. And then we have general student conduct type processes, which are not about discrimination, plagiarism. We had a fight. I spilled beer on my roommate's head and she got angry, et cetera. There's sort of the usual stuff. And part of what the university has been doing is just thinking through the right way to adjudicate different issues. But you have different tracks for students, and similarly for faculty, you've got special processes when it comes to discrimination.
This is a question coming in live from a member of the Columbia College class of 1994. If the report is a set of recommendations to the university, when will the leadership announce which aspects it will be taking on board? And if inadequate enforcement of existing guidelines has been an issue to date, do you think enforcement will improve going forward? And if so, why?
Yeah. So look, one of the main recommendations of our report has actually already been implemented. This speaker's corner approach, it's something we really support. It's something the university has already been done. And as I said, I think that that's a really positive step to protect free speech rights and also to protect the rights of everybody to have the atmosphere that they want. Enforcement is a key issue. I know just from the many conversations that I've had with colleagues across the university that there have been changes in approach, and that there really has been an effort to try to address issues that we and others have identified. And time will tell about how effective it is, but I can tell you, I think I'm seeing a difference already. And then there will, I hope, be additional guidance about the specifics of what discriminatory harassment means. It really is a matter of legal compliance, so it really is something that needs to come from the university's legal team. And I know that they're hard at work on that, and I expect that we'll see the results before too long.
And this is another legal question along those same lines. Question from the chat: what about hate speech and how is that protected? And then a related question about hate speech from the faculty, and is that different?
So the truth is there's really no legal concept of hate speech. I think what we're really talking about instead is speech that causes a hostile learning and working environment, and that's the standard under Title VI. So I think when people use the phrase hate speech, they're often kind of using that as a shorthand for anti-discrimination rules. But basically, at Columbia, the laws apply, and we have rules that are meant to implement them. And then beyond that, we generally have a default of free speech rights. You can say what you want as long as you're not contributing to a hostile learning and work environment, and so on. So I think the analysis that we've been talking about is exactly the legal analysis that applies to what people might call hate speech.
This is not exactly speech, but it's a related question. Diana Moranis Nasser, Columbia College class of 87, asks, what is going to be done about decorations on the doors of the dorms? As I'm sure you're aware, and perhaps the task force has heard about, sometimes they're not exactly decorations, but there's certainly a visual interpretation of what's on people's mind.
Yeah, and the truth is, this is an important issue that we just haven't addressed as a task force. And I do think some of the themes in that analysis are similar. We want people to have the ability to express themselves. And at the same time, we want to be mindful of the effect of that expression on others and making sure that we're not creating hostile environments for people. But in terms of the specifics of that, we haven't yet looked at it, and so I don't have much to add.
And this is a finer point that Jerry Nagler is asking for as it pertains to the speaker's corner policy. He asks, what if the demonstrations occur in one of those three proper locations that you spelled out for all of us, but if the demonstration itself is very loud or noisy and disruptive, would that be permitted?
It's a great question. And there's actually a bit of a difference between the Barnard and the Columbia policies. So the Barnard policy specifically says no megaphones, no sound enhancement. And the Columbia policy doesn't say that. And instead, the general rules at Columbia are just about disruption. So the clever way that I could answer that is to say, well, if it's disruptive, it violates the rules. But then, of course, there's the question of what disruption means. And so one of the points we make in the report is that we think more specific guidance at Columbia about megaphones and sound enhancement would be really, really helpful, because the point is to allow people to express themselves, but without disrupting academic activity. South Lawn is near Butler Library. So again, the question is a good one.
David, this is more of a mood or vibe question. Do you have reason to be optimistic at this point based on the work you've done with the task force so far and the response you've received from the university?
Yes, I do. And again, I think that it's been a difficult time for lots of people in our community, people with different views, people who are upset, understandably, about challenges in the world. And so I don't say this only about Jewish students, only about Israeli students. I think it's really critical that everybody feel free to express their view. And I also think it's really critical that everybody feels welcome and feels like they belong. And one of the things that is really clear to me is that there is broad and deep support for both of those ideas within the university community. I think everybody thinks that we really need to be sure that everybody has the right to speak and everybody has the right to feel comfortable. And so the fact that at a level of principle there's so much agreement means that we just need to find the right ways to implement those principles to get the job done. And I do think that a lot of very capable and committed people are trying really hard to move the ball forward in making that a success. I hope that the recommendations that we've offered will help. I really believe they can. And others are also doing good work. The Senate is reviewing its rules. The administration is doing an analysis of all kinds of things. And so there's a lot going on. And my hope is that it will be successful.
We've gotten several good questions from Tao Tan, class of 2007. I want to give one of them to you. What policymaking powers, if any, does the task force have?
None. In other words, the task force has no, and so Tao, thank you for the excellent question, because I think people don't necessarily understand what we're there to do, and I shouldn't have waited so long to explain it. Our job is to study the situation, to analyze issues, and to make recommendations. And that's our role. What is definitely not our role is we're not an adjudicative body. So if there's a specific incident on campus, we're not the ones who decide whether it's okay or not okay under whatever test. And so therefore, we don't make statements about specific things that happen because it's not our role. And we also we don't have management responsibilities. So really what we do is recommend, and we've been working closely with other institutions within the university that have that power with the hope that we can help them work out what is best for the university.
And David, the task force on anti-Semitism has been in the spotlight on campus, certainly since the first report came out. And I wonder if you might give us a sense of how or if it might factor into the congressional testimony that we expect that President Shafiq and the Board of Trustee chairs are going to be giving in the coming weeks.
So I do think that we are part of a broader process that the university has launched to try to really make sure that free speech is protected and that everyone feels comfortable and feels like they belong. And so I would expect that when members of the university community testify, my hope is that they'll point to the work that we've done and the work that others have done to show the progress that's being made, and of course also to show the challenges, because there are challenges. And I'll be the first to say that there are. But I don't think these are challenges that are not solvable. I think it's just that we have to figure out the right way to proceed and then do that.
Apart from having three caring, compassionate, thoughtful, and motivated leaders at the head of Columbia's task force on anti-Semitism, how do you think our task force is different from some that we've seen at other leading universities that have not been as effective or as successful as Columbia's? To what do you attribute your success?
So look, we have 15 members, and I want to say about the other 14 that they're just amazing people, and they just care deeply about these issues. They want to get it right. They're spending enormous amounts of time. And I have to say, I'm just inspired to work with all of them. I do think that one of the things President Shafiq really pushed at the beginning was for us to think about what we wanted to achieve and then to pick members who could help us do that. And so part of what had to happen is we needed to have really broad representation. We've got quite a number of schools represented in the task force. Sadly, not every school, but almost every school. We just couldn't have a task force that was so large that it would represent everyone. And we also knew, at least in general terms, that we wanted to do research. We wanted to give recommendations about general policies, and we wanted to look at rules. And so we were able to find members who had the expertise that would help us do that. I will say one other thing, which is that we are a faculty-only task force, and I know graduates have often wondered about that, and they sort of think, well, gee, if faculty are the problem here, how can you possibly have faculty review the situation? Isn't that even, isn't that problematic? And I do take the point, but I think that because faculty are a really important element of the environment at the university, then what we really need to do, we as a task force, is to work with the faculty, kind of build support for the things that the university needs to do. And my guess is that the fact that we're a faculty-only task force maybe gives us a bit of an advantage in working with faculty and making the case to faculty. But I do want to emphasize we're by no means the only ones working on this problem. And so, for example, the university trustees are also really focused on these issues, and they generally are graduates and parents. And so that perspective is certainly represented.
We have some more questions coming in live here, David, about the faculty and specifically course content. We have a question that says, is there an evaluation of course content by the university which may lead to this hate and discriminatory behavior on campus?
So I can tell you that one of the goals of our task force is just to think about gaps in the curriculum, places where we aren't succeeding. And so that is a part of what we'd like to do. We really haven't progressed to the point where we can talk about our analysis yet. But again, I also think as a former dean that the deans at every school should constantly be, and I think are constantly, looking at the curriculum and looking for ways in which it falls short and shoring up strengths and dealing with weaknesses. And so it's got to be a constant process.
David, we have some alums raising their hand and volunteering to help the task force. Adina Levin, Columbia College class of 2011 asks, as with many student alumni groups, the task force seems to lean heavily on the experiences of current students or alumni who are several decades out from their time as college students on campus. How can younger alumni weigh in on and contribute to your important work?
So I appreciate the offer very much. And again, I think that we're all in this together in the sense that we want the university to be its best. And so when people have ideas, they should certainly write to the task force or write to individual members, and that's really helpful. But I do want to pick up on something that you mentioned and that the questioner mentioned, which is, my primary focus is on current students, because I really think that their experience is critical. And we only have them with us in the college for 4 years, and every one of those semesters counts, and we want it to be great. And so it's true, we've been doing listening sessions with students at all the schools because we want to hear about their experiences. We want to hear the good, but especially we want to hear about the problems, because it's essential that the university responds to those problems.
Forgive me, earlier I asked you some questions about BDS, and I realized I really should define that for the call. So forgive me to anyone who I use that acronym without defining it. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Against Israel. And we do have another question coming in live, David, about these litmus tests, as you call them, to campus organizations. Lou Shanek says, you said that certain campus organizations have proposed BDS, again, boycott, divestment, and sanctions policies, and divestment from educational programs in Israel, etc. Are these just opinions or the result of a student referendum, or can any of this actually be binding on the university?
So it's not binding on the university. I think it's more that these are ways in which individual members of our community express opinions. And I can tell you that over the years, there have been faculty letters calling for this, and then faculty letters responding and saying no, ties to Israel are important. And I know about this because I've often been involved in drafting letters about the importance of connections to Israel. But at the end of the day, these are decisions that would require broad consensus, which it's very clear we don't have. Sort of need virtual unanimity, I think, about the importance of severing ties, which isn't what I see on campus today. And I think at the end of the day, it's really the university trustees and the senior leadership that make this judgment. So it's really, these resolutions are kind of a way for individual members of our community to signal their views, but it isn't binding.
Well, I don't want to say goodnight to you, David, without giving you, I always ask this at the end of interviews that I do for work. I say, is there anything that you wanted to talk about tonight, or anything that came up in your mind during our conversation that I didn't ask you about and that none of the other alums asked you about that you'd like to say now?
Thank you. Look, I do think this has been a wonderfully thorough conversation. And what really strikes me is that the very thoughtful questions that have come in just emphasize what Jen, you and I already know, which is both that we have this incredibly capable group of alumni, and also that they really do love Columbia the way you and I do, and what could be better than that? So thank you.
Well, I want to just end. I'm going to let Gary Skazmari have a word. He says, Jen and David, thank you so much for the excellent job you've done with this program. It was far more engaging and enlightening than I possibly could have imagined. I learned a great deal. Thank you. Gary is CC class of 1972, and he adds a PS and says, I was locked out of classroom buildings several times during my studies. So David, as I was saying to you at the outset, and I just want to emphasize now as we wrap things up with the program tonight, I asked you before if you have reason for optimism. And I just want to say, as a Columbia College alum, that I have reason for optimism because of people like you and people who are thoughtful and hardworking and caring and compassionate, and that you really are taking a look at this very important issue on campus. I thank you so much for spending close to 90 minutes with all of us tonight, answering dozens of our questions and doing such a beautiful job in explaining what the task force has been working on, what you plan to do next, and what we can expect. And again, I think you and the team have been so effective, and I just really can't thank you enough. And I just appreciate the time that we all spent together tonight. And thank you to all the alums for listening in as well. And for the last word tonight, we are going to hear from Carlos Cuevas. Carlos is the executive committee member with the Columbia College Alumni Association, which sponsored tonight's event and did such a beautiful job in planning and executing it. So Carlos, take it away.
Great, thank you. Well, I first have to say, Gary, you stole a little bit of my thunder, but you said it so well. Again, Carlos Cuevas here, class of 2005, member of the executive committee for the CCAA. I want to really share my sincere thanks with Jennifer and Professor Shizer for an enlightening conversation about the progress being made and the efforts to make Columbia's campus safe and inclusive. This is a journey, and your insights have really helped us navigate these complex times. Through the generosity of the Ranieri Fund for Nonprofit Management at Columbia Law School and the Columbia College Alumni Association, participants have the opportunity to receive a free copy of Professor Shizer's new book, How to Save the World in 6 Not-So-Easy Steps, Bringing Out the Best in Nonprofits. As you will see, the production team has entered a link in the chat for you to request your copy. Please click on the link, fill out the information. We will also be following up via email for the link. But again, my sincere thanks to both Jennifer and to Professor Shizer. Now, next up, our next alumni talk will take place on Tuesday, April 30th. That alumni talk is entitled Crisis and Community, the Value of the Core Curriculum in Times of Turmoil, and is a conversation with Professor Larry Jackson, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and the Director of the Whidden Center for the Core Curriculum at Columbia College. He will be interviewed by none other than Sarah Just, CC88, who is the executive producer for the PBS NewsHour. The formal invitation for that virtual event will be sent out in the coming weeks, so please keep an eye out for that. And again, I believe Professor Shizer really touched on that, but we want to thank, on behalf of the alumni community, thank you to our speakers, and most importantly, to our Columbia alumni. We encourage you to stay involved and engaged with the college community. Reach out to us, and you can reach out via email at ccalumni@columbia.edu. And with all that said, thank you and have a wonderful evening.